Hello, everyone, and welcome back to yet another episode of the War Report. I'm very glad to see that you all enjoyed our episode with Geo. It's always a great time to have him on. We could always go on for hours. Unfortunately, I had to cut that one a bit short because of some time constraints. Not to mention, I I, I was probably now. Fortunately, I didn't. I was probably going to lose my power because of just weather reasons and whatnot. So I didn't want to lose that audio gold in order to just extend it by 10 or 20 minutes. So I hope everyone enjoyed that. The feedback has been very positive. Of course, I can't give an exact date, but it's almost inevitable that Gio will return to us soon, and we'll have plenty of more great episodes with him. But for now, we just want to do a little bit of a follow up on some of the stories we covered, particularly with Prigozhin and the outcome and his new life in exile in Belarus. Of course, we have some updates from the front in Ukraine, and also this developing situation in France, as well as a few other stories around Europe and elsewhere. So, without further ado, I'll hand you the floor and you can go ahead and give us the excruciating detail of everything going on in Ukraine because, like I said, I don't mean to speak too highly of ourselves, but in terms of detailed analysis, well, not even analysis, I would say I would give us a lot of credit on the analysis front too, but in terms of details on what's actually happening on the ground in Ukraine, I have not met anyone either in person or online that goes into as meticulous detail as you do. And like I said, I've
Mm,
like there's been a couple times where I had to do it. I'd like to think I did a decent job, but you gotta touch for it, and I think I love it,
oh,
and I
well,
think the
thank you.
audience loves it. So, without further ado,
Thank you.
give us the minutia minute.
Yes. Several things have happened, even though it's only been about 5 days since our last show. Some are significant, some are less significant. One of the things that happened, beginning in the south in Kherson, is uh, the last time we did the show, I mentioned that small boatloads had been trying to cross the Dnieper River over to the east side after the destruction of the Novokhovka Dam. And there is also a bridge there that isn't part of that isn't the bridge where the dam was. Okay, so there's a separate bridge. It's just I think it's the Antonovsky Bridge, if I'm not mistaken. And of course, when the Russians retreated from the west side of Kherson, the, well, uh, now with much lower water levels, the Ukrainians began to accumulate. Also, like I said on the last show, instead of being spotted in large columns, they're moving their men over in small groups and just accumulating in certain areas. And the Russians have had a difficult time trying to oust them. Now, this is a very small bridgehead that was taken, and they're using essentially the panels of the bridge that hadn't been destroyed as cover. But today, they've been able to oust them. There are still reports that on some of the islets along the river, um, the Ukrainians have set up some kind of positions there. It should be noted that these guys are very lightly armed. They do not have tanks with them. They don't even have, as far as I know, a Humvee. So I've seen footage where some of them were forced to retreat. That's about 4, 5, 6 days ago, but they managed to gain a foothold. And again, the area if that we're talking about of the Antonovsky Bridge, they have been removed from there. If there are small islands, I mean, I don't know how much you can call these islands based on water level. In any case, if there are, that's where they are right now. I sent you a bunch of photos of, not photos or graphics of the Zaporozhye front, and this will explain the fighting that has been going on since the last 5, 6 days.
Okay, I'll get those up.
Um, Yeah, so there's one with I believe it's kind of like a close up. I mean, none of them are actually a close up. I think um oh, I sent you two of the same one. So The second one I sent you, the one at the bottom, shows the fighting basically what is in proper Zaporozhye. And the thing that's important to note here is Piatihatki is still in a contested zone, so there hasn't been any significant movement there. Um, in south of Orechov, again, not much has been going on. Um, Rabotino is still a village that is under Russian control, but the Ukrainians have managed to inch closer to it. And then if we move further east, we get to that whole area of Vremenovka, Bolshaya Novoselka, that area, right? So just south of Makarovka is the town of Staromayorskoye and Urozhanye. Urozhanye is one of the areas that we'll get into precaution. He said it had fallen, and later he had even more wild um, statements that Tokmak had been reached. Tokmak is significantly lower down than that. Uh, the area just slightly to the east of that is there's a town called Levad, Levadnoye. Levadnoye has been the Ukrainians have had that for at least 10 days, I think, or maybe 8, but the area around it is still contested. Um, North of that in Novodarovka, they have taken that. And of course, the village that they did recently take is Ravnopol, that the Ukrainians called Rivnopol. I don't know why they do that, but um, because Rav means flat, means even, and it's a pretty important word in Slavic languages because like the word like in Russian здравствуйте or zdras in Ukrainian or zdravo in Serbian, Croatian, Macedonian, and Bulgarian is just made up like Rav flat means good. So you can see kind of like the step origins of Slavic languages. So z is with, d, do is to, and rav to the place that is flat. That is good. That's positive. Anyways, so I thought I'd mention that. Um, so these are small gains, and there have been articles that have recently come out that are very, very interesting. They're talking about the cost, basically the cost of the gains for the Ukrainians that I really didn't expect to see. One of these articles focused on the area, basically the fight that took place on June 8th, and uh, it was basically saying that the losses for vehicles and manpower was much larger than they had anticipated. Something I just didn't think I would read, at least not right now. Um, it mentions how many vehicles were destroyed in this headline. Um, Something like over 30 in less than 24 hours. Um, anyway, so so the Western press is admitting that the Zaporozhye front is not in a good place. Um, and it's just something I wasn't anticipating at this stage, but I guess it's become kind of undeniable, and they've had to more or less admit to it. Um, Going on to other news, the Ukrainians have managed to gain some small areas of control around the Bakhmut area, not in the city, but towards the area of Klishevka in the south and areas in the north, not close to Solidar, but moving toward that area. Um, Interestingly, the Russian MOD had said that it does not believe it does not believe that Ukraine has the strength to retake the city. And something interesting about this is, we talk about the Zaporozhye um, entrenchments that have successfully held the Ukrainians in that position now for 24 or 25 days. Um, those similar trench works were made in Donetsk and Lugansk, but they are to the east of the city of Bakhmut. So this kind of puts um, it tends to indicate that that the Russians did not intend to take Bakhmut, at least not right away. That they thought that they probably anticipated the Ukrainians to push through in this area. Uh, just it's not something I honestly I didn't consider it until I finally it finally hit me today. But does this mean that the Russians are going to give up uh, Bakhmut? Probably not, because I think that would be a major embarrassment.
Oh, they sunk so
Um,
much into it at this point, and I mean,
yeah.
you can have the conversation about strategic value all you want, and that was a major conversation during the actual Battle of Bakhmut for both sides, of course. Especially on the Ukrainian side, it oscillated. It is a key battlefield. It is something that we need. Oh, it's just symbolic. It's something that we can sacrifice. It went back and forth, of course, depending on whatever was
Hmm.
convenient,
Hmm.
however the Ukrainians were doing. But at this point, with the amount of blood and treasure Russia put into taking Bakhmut, they cannot afford to sacrifice it simply for the sake of morale.
Yeah. So exactly, that would destroy morale. But it has to be said that I mean, yes, the Ukrainians have suffered heavy losses to gain the territories that they have around there. But the fact of the matter is, it would be uh, oddly enough, the West would accept Ukrainian losses more than, let's say, than the Russian public would accept losing Bakhmut. That would be, honestly, that would be like pretty catastrophic. It would be like, and I think it's, in a way, it's very costly. I don't know what other option the Ukrainians have, but it is a strategy. On the show, I outlined what the American Cohen visiting the Polish Institute for International Studies said, that there's no need to march on Moscow to defeat it, implying also that they can't. But there's a better, more elegant solution to the problem, and that is, if you demoralize the people, then you can win. And this is why they go for so many optics victories, right? Is to constantly create a sense of panic. And I suppose the other big news on the front, now there is, I should mention that there isn't too much happening at the moment around the Kupiansk Kremenaya area. I mentioned the last show that there was a village toward Liman that was taken. It's not in Liman, but it's outside of it. So the Russians have been pressing there. The Ukrainians have countered in order to prevent the Russians from going into that area. Shelling in Belgorod continues. Shelling in Donetsk City continues. This is to try to draw the Russians away. Um, I think the Ukrainians are looking for an area to bust through in either Zaporozhye or maybe around Ugledar. But strangely, Ugledar is extremely quiet in comparison to the rest of the fronts. The fronts are very active, but they are not as active as they were, let's say, 2 weeks ago. The intensity is less. It has decreased. The um, the other thing that should be mentioned, of course, is there was an attack on Kramatorsk. Now, In the last few months, we have looked at, I've talked about Kramatorsk getting hit, Slavyansk getting hit, right? These are important um, control centers for the Eastern Front for the Ukrainian army. Um, these are the ring of towns very close to one another, sometimes, just a couple of kilometers or 5, 6 kilometers separating one, municipal jurisdiction from the other. So it goes from Slavyansk to Kramatorsk to Konstantinovka. And the Russians fired 2 missiles into what looks like a hotel and restaurant. Initially, the reports were, women and children have been killed, and there's no doubt that civilians probably died, but there's no proof that women and children have been killed. And then even Ukrainian sources started to admit that there were soldiers there. And then yesterday, there was video, um, and in it is a guy with what to me sounds like a South African accent. I had a boss that was South African, and honestly, it sounds a little bit like English and a little bit like Australian put together, with just like a tiny bit of a Germanic sound. It's very unique, but initially it will sound more like Australian English than anything else. In any case, and this video has kind of gone viral because it shows just the level of devastation caused by the attack. And he says, these are his words, not mine. These fucking Russians is nothing sacred. They've attacked soldiers, real living, breathing soldiers, innocent soldiers. What world? It's
it
just look what they're
it's
doing
not
to this country. And
that
um
that sounds like parody. The Russians are attacking us, poor
oh, no, no,
innocents.
sorry, this is sorry, somebody did write this as parody. No, he's saying
Uh,
look what they're doing to this country. um these bastards, right? um uh, there's soldiers underneath this rubble, right? uh, what he's trying to tell people is like it's perfectly legitimate for soldiers to accumulate in civilian areas in large numbers,
now,
right?
now,
That's
keep
what
in
he's.
mind, these are a lot of the people who are shills for this war. Of course, not all of them, but a significant amount are also shills for the Zionists, so to speak. And one major criticism they always bring up about the strikes in Gaza, is that Hamas hides out among civilian targets. In which case,
Mhm,
there's that. And I mean,
mhm.
that is something that happens in war, especially when it comes to the quote unquote underdog, the less powerful side. The Taliban, Al Qaeda did this. Groups in Syria did this, where they will hide out in civilian targets because at that point they know if they're being struck, there will be collateral damage, and it is a PR war against the enemy because that is an area where you can defeat them. But it actually, touching on what you were saying, I'm sure you saw the thread that I sent you earlier today about
Yeah.
how there were AFU vehicles in the area that the SBU was arrested, well, detained somebody for taking too many photographs and acting suspicious as if he were uh, doing surveillance on a military site. And then
Hmm,
you
hmm.
mentioned the presence of foreign fighters, particularly the South African. I believe they also caught an American on recording. They had guys who were there in pretty
Yes.
generic pretty generic military uniforms, but had various American patches. For example, the 101st Airborne and other very recognizable patches, which it does make you wonder about the optics of it all. Where assume and look, it's obvious that American volunteers are here in large numbers, probably with the sponsorship of the United States government. But it does make you wonder why they would be so blatant about it, why they would uh,
Hmm, hmm.
wear their patches. And once again, you know, I know that people who have military service records, whether that be American or anything else really, do have a great deal of pride in wherever they serve, and understandably so. It's again something that forged you, but you would think that for the sake of pragmatism, for the sake of the mission, that they would be a little bit more conspicuous about it. And when you start to see
Yes.
videos of guys with American military insignias in this area that got struck, once again, it rings some alarm bells. And again, there's several pictures of these, and And then you also have pictures of what is reported there to be fully uniformed Ukrainian soldiers there about 20 minutes before the strike. So, what I would imagine this was, and this isn't going to be an insightful take or anything, but I think it still is worth saying regardless, is that this was probably some sort of command center that, of course, they put in the middle of a civilian area because when the inevitable happens, when the Russians strike at this command center, there's going to be civilian casualties, as is an
Yeah.
unfortunate reality of war. And once again, I'm not going to morally grandstand about one side or the other. My biases are pretty clear. I'm trying not to let that affect me right here. But ultimately, that's how these things work. And the question of civilian casualties, it, I hate to put it this way, but it really comes down to, is it for a worthy cause? Because it is inevitable in war. And it's something that, look, morally speaking, should be minimized. And something that I would say the Russians generally have, especially considering the nature of this war and considering the fact they want to integrate a lot of these areas that they are fighting in. You don't want to start wasting civilians in areas that you're trying to conquer, at least
Yes.
in this day
Yes.
and age. Now, I've heard some Russians say at this point they should just flatten Western Ukraine because they have no intention of trying to annex Galicia and they should just wage a complete terror campaign. I mean, look, that's their opinion. I don't really have a strong way one way or another, but fundamentally, especially with what we're looking at, the kind of war that's being fought right now, this isn't exactly America and Iraq, even though if you ask Joe Biden, Putin is losing the war in Iraq. That was a clip that actually came out this
Hmm.
week that I think I'm obligated to mention. Once again, they're fighting. I don't want to call it a war of liberation because that sounds, again, it sounds too put on. It sounds too propagandistic. But they are fighting
Yeah.
a war of reintegration of these areas that were historically part of Russia. And if we're to believe what the Russian government's saying, which I would say to a degree you can believe them at face value, that they are fighting a war to integrate these territories from an illegitimate regime in Kiev. I think that all adds up on a very surface level. Once again, that's not an area where you exactly want to do these terror bombings.
Right. 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 And I mean, there is a kind of flagrancy that you have from the West, like you would have thought they would have learned their lesson from the attacks in early March of last year in Lvov, where well, I mean, look, it was definitely over 100 mercenaries were killed, right? But today, the Russian MOD today has actually said that two generals were killed in this attack, along with several officers and at least 20 mercenaries. Um, Kramatorsk became like the command center while the fighting in Bakhmut, Artemyevsk was going on, right? That was Bakhmut's previous role before the encroachment around it. So they moved their bases further east to Kramatorsk. So I have no doubt that's the case, or it certainly makes the idea like it's certainly a possibility, right? That it would be either in Slavyansk or Kramatorsk. Those are the two bigger towns. After that, it's just all farmland, and then you get to the Dnieper River. Um, I would also say that it's important to understand that this hotel was not open to the public. This was strictly an area for the military. In all the videos, you just see like almost entirely military guys in their fatigues trying to rescue people, soldiers that are underneath the rubble. There's no question this was a very big hit, and it could be that like let's say there are certain unspoken agreements between the Americans and the Russians. Like if you do this, I'm going to take out a command center, right? And Russia says, I mean, America says you don't have any red lines that we can't cross. And then they will hit them. They will hit them usually much later. But remember that a few weeks ago, Putin said that they are going to start going after command centers, and they nearly killed Budanov. They certainly killed who was. They probably killed a lot of people who were with Budanov or in that building, based on the evidence that I've seen. Budanov did go to the hospital. His head was completely shaven. Obviously, he went through something. He's lucky to have survived. So Um, I would say that mm, it's a pretty significant thing. Um, I noticed on Twitter, people were like, like the pro-Ukraine side were just like losing their minds over this. They were just enraged that this had happened. So yeah,
But ultimately, once again, I don't think this is going to be a story of great consequence now. After,
yeah.
especially, I would say a lot of the terror of Russia and the atrocities of Russia lost a lot of steam, particularly after, and I don't know whether we're still allowed to mention the name of the town, but a certain town where there were allegedly mass graves from Russian atrocities from last year. So
Mhm.
I think after that, after it was proven dubious at best, and then later came out that this most likely didn't even happen at all, a lot of people, even who are not quote unquote pro Russia, lost a lot of faith in the Ukrainian side because you'll have noticed in public opinion that there has been a trend uh, where a lot of people initially thought, oh, of course, Russian aggression, they shouldn't invade other nations. But as the war went on, as it got more convoluted, as the Ukrainians got more brazen in terms of both their strategy and their demands in the West, a lot of people soured on it to the point where a lot of people are just wanting, they just want the war to stop. They don't care who's winning, who's losing. They just want it to be over and want us to wash our hands of it, which I think is probably
Mhm.
the centrist American opinion at this point. And you'll see a lot of the politicians have to pander to that. And a lot of, especially back in the 2022 midterms, that was the campaign line of the Republicans when it came to foreign aid to Ukraine. Now, of course, once they were all sworn in for the next session of Congress, the Republican Congress under isn't McCarthy? Did he end up getting Speaker of the House? At this point, I don't even remember. Pledging more aid than ever to Ukraine, and it's yeah, that's to be expected. But point being is, when it comes to stories like this, they've lost a lot of punch with the public. Number one, because a lot of people are less inclined to believe them outright. And number two, people are just more desensitized to these things, especially as this war's gone on for about a year and a quarter. People are expecting these kind of stories. They expect that during wars, these kind of things happen. And that doesn't make them it, right or desirable, but it's something that people just learn to live with or tune out or ignore because at the end of the day, being just somebody on the ground, being a civilian in the U.S. or whatever Western country, there's not really anything you can do about it. So I would say there's a certain malaise setting in when it comes to the general public, when it comes to their attitude during this of this war. And I haven't looked at opinion polls recently, but once again, I do just from personal observation from both discourse with people I know in real life and people I see on the internet, even on the quote unquote more normie side, there's just a bit more of an apathy about this war, especially from February of 2022, that the public just is not as invested. They've moved on to whatever the next issue is. And look, that could just be some petty issue, or it could be something a bit more substantial, or it could be something very important. For example, a lot of the, I guess for lack of a better term, culture war issues, where it comes to, hey, what are these kids being taught in school? Hey, how safe is it to walk in the street at night? Can I trust that I won't be mugged or beaten or whatever else? Again, those sort of things, especially when it comes to politics and society, and in terms of as much as you believe the vote counts. And I say that in a purely broad context. I would never imply any sort of wrongdoings in elections and election countings. That's for our friends at YouTube. But once again, those sort of issues take priority in people's minds over a war in Eastern Europe. And again, it's understandable. I mean, look, if I didn't do this show, if I didn't have the, as much as I hate to put it this way, the online presence I did, I would probably be much the same way when it comes to the way I conduct my everyday life and what I'm concerned about for the good of myself and the people I care about. Again, it is those issues and not some war in Eastern Europe. That, frankly, my biggest concern on a level outside of like this show and analysis of it is what if this spirals out of control and draws the entire world into it, which I think is still a very real possibility at this point. I'm not saying it's a likelihood, but we do have to be aware of that possibility that this war could turn apocalyptic very quickly.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. Just to backtrack a little bit, so it was Forbes that had two very interesting stories that I was implying in my minutia. The first one is how Ukrainian police are missing in action. It's got a photo of members of the 117th Mechanized Brigade with one of their tracked artillery pieces. People sort of unfamiliar with military hardware will think this is just an enormous tank. Roughly, that's what it looks like. Um, and it says something like in Ukraine's 18th day old southern counteroffensive, the 117th Brigade with their AS-90 howitzer, they've been depleted. Like they're calling them missing in action, but like there's just a lot of destroyed men and material that the Ukrainian government is not willing to acknowledge as such. And the other Forbes article was titled 25 Tanks and Fighting Vehicles Gone in a Blink. The Ukrainian defeat near Malatokmachka. This is in that area, I believe, in the eastern side of Zaporozhye. Um, if it's not there, then it's in Orekhov. It was one of the villages that the Russians lost very early on. And this is one of the two areas that's like a grave site of vehicles. And it says Ukraine widely anticipated 2023 counteroffensive was just 4 days old when the 47th and 33rd Battle Group rolled south from Tokmachka in Ukraine's Zaporozhye Oblast. The smoke cleared to reveal no fewer than 25 wrecked Ukrainian vehicles, 17 M2s, 4 Leopard 2A6 tanks, 3 Leopard 2Rs, and 1 Wiznet. Wiznet is a type of mine clearing vehicle. In a bloody hour or two, the 47th and 33rd Brigade Battle Group lost nearly a fifth of Ukrainians' M2s, a fifth of its Leopard 2A6S, and half its Leopard 2Rs. Despite being the equivalent of an entire battalion in a single botched assault, the 33rd and 47th Brigades apparently remain intact and still are in the fight. It is undeniable that the June 8th battle south of Malatokmachka was a disaster for the Ukrainian army. Um, yeah, so it's stories like that that have been pouring out. A little over a week ago, Der Spiegel had a story. Was I think it was Der Spiegel? If not, it was in Bild, and basically it said Ukraine. Like after this battle, that I've highlighted just now, uh, they became worried about going into this area. So they began wrecking their equipment so they wouldn't be sent. I was surprised that like such a prominent German publication would publish something like that. In any case, that's
Well, I'm glad you brought that up because that ties into some interesting demographic information I came across today that I think certainly needs a little bit more discussion than what I saw. So,
okay.
63% of Ukrainians now say they at least know one close relative or friend who has died in the war, with an average number being three.
Mm,
Huge increase from the survey last February, which found only 17% of Ukrainians reported a loss, while the figure in September of 22 was about 9%. This firmly suggests that the Bakhmut meat grinder did its job and that the Ukrainian counteroffensive is going as poorly as previously thought. Also, as of note, the deaths are concentrated highly regionally, 69% in the west, just as 52% in the east, and this would imply heavier losses from the main bastions of Ukrainian nationalist areas. And once again, to quote Intel Slava, where I'm getting this data from, they link the full survey. It's in Ukrainian, so I can't read it. So if anyone has a grasp on Ukrainian, it's worth looking into. But the implications are pretty obvious, and we are seeing, especially with the recent data on this survey, where as the deaths start to shift westward, it once again shows that Western Ukrainian men are being called upon more to take up more of an active role in this war, whereas a lot of the men thrown into the meat grinder at the beginning of the war were from central and eastern Ukraine. And once we're talking, to reference the study, an average of 3 people, uh,
Yeah.
as Ukrainians know, who have died in this conflict. And we've talked about the number of Ukrainian losses. There was the stories coming out right before Bakhmut. In fact, it was Military Summary who did a really good video on it. His stuff is really good in general. If you want some very unbiased analysis of the war, I would certainly recommend his channel as well. But talking about where he would just show the interviews with these Ukrainians and show the reports on the ground of a lot of these guys saying we had 3 to 5 days of training before being thrown into this meat grinder, particularly for Bakhmut. And as you're talking about right now, the sabotaging of equipment so they don't have to be sent to the front lines. And I believe, as we had mentioned last episode, Ukraine is now on its 11th mobilization. And in terms of pools of
Yeah.
manpower, I believe with this mobilization, the 11th one, they're looking to call up about 50,000 more men for the war effort, which maybe I
I
just
think
have.
it's 90.
Oh wow, that that sounds more
Yeah, I read
reasonable,
90.
because I was about to say 50,000 sounded a bit low even for what the Ukrainian goals were. But yeah, if it's 90,000, that adds up. And with the amount of emigration coming out of Ukraine over the past decade since the Maidan, and also especially since the outbreak of war. Now, I know that one of the first things the Ukrainian authorities did was severely hamper the ability of fighting age men to leave the country for obvious reasons, where a lot of men who were not of fighting age or fighting condition were able to slip out in the early months, and of course, women and children as well. And on the Russian side, it's a different story, because the ones that were able to escape to the Russian side, they would take just about anyone, because when a lot of the people fleeing to the Russian side obviously have more sympathy towards Russia, if not outright see themselves as ethnic Russians. So, yeah, a bit of a different story between East and West is to be expected. But I'm not saying Ukraine doesn't have 90,000 men to draw upon, but when you're on your 11th wave of mobilization in a war like this, when the upper end of casualties can be expected to be around 250,000 for Ukraine. Now, whether I believe it's that high, I think 250,000 might be a little bit of a stretch. Now, I don't think it's too much of a stretch, but I think it's a little bit of an exaggeration if you ask me. That's the higher end. And then the low end, it's a
Mhm.
massive disparity where,
I mean, that would be maybe killed and wounded,
yeah, I could see killed and wounded, but
if that.
yeah, I could certainly see that. But I think it's probably closer to the 100,000 figure, which was touted as the lower end figure of these studies. But point being is, we're talking about. I think at this point the conscription pool is ages 16 to 64. So
Mm.
that's, once again, those are not numbers you want to see. Those are numbers that you see when a nation is losing a war. These are the numbers that you saw in Germany when the tide was turning against them in World War II, to use a very overused example. These are the numbers that the Spanish Republicans were using in 1938, which I think should paint an even clearer picture.
Yes, those are both very good points, good examples. Especially the because I always forget about the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, and I,
Um,
I would say, as strange as it sounds, out of all the parallels I can find in this war, especially when it comes to the political polarization, I think this war greatly resembles the Spanish Civil War in many ways.
yes, yes, even if it's a redux in
Yeah,
in in in,
absolutely.
in many regards. Although I was listening to Academic Agent and he had like I'm not gonna mention his name, but one of the guests they're talking about Surovikin and Prigozhin and what's going on and blah blah blah. And one of them says, "Well, the Russians are also using Western narratives about like Nazis in Ukraine." It's like, that's not a Western narrative.
Hold on. Let me get the picture of the average Russian's
It's
opinion.
not like a Western narrative the way you think it's a Western narrative. It's something fundamentally different for the Russians because like they lost over 20 million civilians, right? It's not like just some little trick that they do
Okay,
for
I'll
social
reiterate.
conditioning.
I have the image up, and I think you know which one I'm talking about. This is the Russian opinion of this war. Whenever they bring up fascism or Nazism, this is what they're
Yeah.
talking about right here. This guy. This is what they mean. I,
Yes,
and
yeah.
again, you can't even see my screen. You know exactly what
I know
picture
the
I'm.
image. I know exactly which. Yeah. So they have a very different take on it than the West does, and actually, like he misses the point because in a way he's so American centric, he's unaware. So the first mistake is calling it a Western narrative, like some silly trick, right? Yeah, I mean the Russians are saying it, but the primary audience that they're saying it to is the Russian audience, not necessarily the Western audience is part of it, but that's not the first concern. The second part that he misses is when the Russians say that, it increases patriotism, right? When the West does that, it does the opposite. That's the difference,
Oh,
right?
absolutely, and
And
you can actually see
you,
this.
you have to you have
In
to be very unaware. You have to be very unaware. You have to be kind of like willfully dumb not to see that.
Yeah, and I would also make the point you could see probably up until I would say the end of the Cold War, where when World War II was invoked in America during the Cold War, I would say up until the 80s, it was to call back to those patriotic sentiments, like think about what your fathers and grandfathers did, and think about the great things they accomplished
Yeah.
for us. And that once again, that's the way the Russians use their World War II narrative today. Think about the great things that the men who came before you did, especially when they're talking to their troops. Whereas when it comes to uh, modern World War II narratives in the West, particularly in the U.S., it's about how we defeated the evil racist mustache man and how we secured LGBTQ CIA and
Yeah, yeah,
minority
yeah,
rights
yeah.
across.
It has
Once again,
this
that
whole other
nonsense.
component. Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's exactly it.
Yeah, and like World War II, of course, has been the prime one that the Russians have called back when it comes to their narrative with this, but you have to keep in mind they've done this with other wars as well. They're not afraid to invoke other parts of their history. I mean, and once again, Putin's been doing this since he's been in office. Actually, it was interesting because I think it was the speech upon the ascension of Crimea into the Russian Federation. He actually mentioned the Crimean War, which, as you all know, was an embarrassing defeat for Russia as part of that. Now, again, so he's not. The Russians aren't opposed to using historical narrative. World War II is just so prescient. Not to mention, while not entirely, it still is somewhat within living memory. It's
Hmm.
once and also that you mentioned the scale to which it took place was monumental. But you have to keep in mind that Putin's speech announcing what I guess is still called, and at the time especially was called the special military operation or the um, let's just if we're calling a spade, the war in Ukraine. A lot of it was about how the early Bolsheviks, especially upon the early rise of the Soviet Union in the 1920s, created these artificial and incoherent borders, which led to just cycles upon cycles of crisis that we're still experiencing today. Then that this military operation was supposed to be about, and arguably, I would say, still is. So, once again, getting caught up on the fact that Russia invokes the World War II narrative, it's while, as you said, of course, part of it plays into Western propaganda, part of it is trying to play up to maybe more left-leaning Western dissidents, where it's like you claim to hate fascism and all of this, but why is your government supporting them in Ukraine? It's a cheap narrative, but
Yeah, yeah.
it does what it's supposed to. But once again, primarily they're speaking to the Russian ethnos, the people who had their fathers, grandfathers, other family members who fought in this war, the people who show up every day on Victory Day with their portraits, these things.
Right. And even the relics from, former Soviet era, like for a lot of people, these relics aren't like they're not sacred in terms of like Marxist or Leninist ideology at all. Like, um, many of the people who like brazen them or they're actually just Orthodox Christians. They're not even communists,
Yeah, if
right?
you were to
And even
just like
like
give them a basic
members of the Russian Communist Party like attend church. Even their leader has like told them you should go to church. It's good for you
Yeah, and
and
like if you were
stuff.
to do a basic political survey of these people, especially by Western standards, they're very right wing. It's just that the Soviet nostalgia has a large play of back when, of course, Russia was a very powerful nation, and once again, as I put it before, people nostalgic for the Brezhnev era.
Right, right, right. And it's back in 2018 when the World Cup was going on. One of my Serbian friends was there to, to soak it in. He was in St. Petersburg, and there were posters that were put up telling Russian women not to sleep with foreigners, especially Africans. And the posters were made by the Communist Party of Russia.
And once
So
again,
like
if you want an
like
example,
here, because of course here in North America particularly, but also in Western Europe, it's this boomer idea that like the Cold War was about leftist, Russian leftist communists versus conservative libertarian free market ideologues, whatever. Like that's like a boomer truth, and like even Trump's like latest dumb boomer truth move. You can look at it cynically. If he's elected, he's going to stop Marxist indoctrination. It's like it's not like the American machine just takes parts and pieces of previous ideologies and weaves them. Like it's not
yeah, it's
like
like
they're extremely flexible, they're extremely pragmatic. It's not what you think it is, right? But people want it to be that because they think, well, if I just turn this Marxist tap off, then we'll like rescue the country.
yeah,
It's
like
kind of like saying, well, if we just elect Trump, then we'll fix it's really dumb.
just to touch on a few of those points, like I have no problem using Marxists or communists as like a pejorative for leftists, but if you think that's the actual root of the problem, you're not looking deep enough at this. Of course, they'll adopt the language and the trappings, but to think that these people are dedicated Marxist-Leninists from the 1920s and 30s, once again,
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
you're, you're missing the mark. I'm not saying that you're like completely ignorant of what's happening, but you're simplifying it far too much. And also, talking about the Cold War and the rhetoric with that, it's interesting because you look at this. I mean, there's several instances of the Americans supporting anti-Soviet socialist parties and movements throughout the Cold War. And there's instances of the Soviet Union supporting what could be considered very right-wing and fascistic governments. Once again, it came a lot down to pragmatism, really.
Hmm.
What was
Hmm.
in raw self-interest. So, yeah, getting lost in this ideological idea of the Cold War is also a bit of a trap people get caught in. And also, I wanted to just mention the last thing about the Soviet symbolism in Russia. I believe I had mentioned this last time, either the last episode of the episode before then, about this new monument that Russia built that had the three flags that had the current tricolor, the Soviet flag, and the imperial tricolor. I mean, it ultimately comes down to, and something I can actually greatly respect the Russians for, is they are unabashedly proud of their history, and they're not going to shy away from any aspect of it, whether their successes were under the imperial tricolor or the hammer and sickle or the modern red, white, and blue tricolor. It once again, it's all one Russian nation, one Russian people that they view as a continuity. Now, sure, there may have been failures by any of those given governments, but they're not going to overlook the great things that they accomplished because of whoever was in power at the time or whatever ideological qualms they might have had with them.
Right, and Putin even set up a Gulag museum in order to, basically have a kind of criticism of the Soviet past, right?
Yeah, and
Like
I think that
in a
like
kind of never again gesture.
yeah, and I think aside from very nostalgic boomers, a lot of at least politically aware Russians have a very reasonable take on its Soviet past, realizing that yeah, sure we accomplished great things, but there was obvious reasons the Soviet Union failed. And like to invoke Putin once again, I think it was that one speech in the late 2000s. He said it's become a cliche at this point, but it's like if you don't miss the Soviet Union, you don't have a heart, but if you want it back, you don't have a brain.
Yeah, 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 yeah,
And
yeah,
I
yeah,
think like
yeah.
it's a gross simplification, but I think it ultimately gets the point across when it comes to
Hmm.
Russia's Soviet
Hmm.
past.
Yeah, it's very complex, but it is in the past. That's kind of like I mean, you and I are both Orthodox Christians, and we're both monarchists. Of course, we don't like communism, right? But we're trying
No, but we're not
to
going to have this two-dimensional
elucidate.
view of history.
Right, right. We're trying to elucidate for people like how Russians see it, not how like Westerners see it, because It matters.
And like, yeah, I know you clearly being a Slav have a far greater connection to this, whereas I'm just like a mutt of like Celtic Mediterranean, so I'm pretty far removed from Russia. But I mean, ultimately, at the end of the day, it's their historical narrative to grapple with, and it's something they have to figure out. And
Yeah.
I think they've actually figured out a very healthy and coherent way to deal with their own history, to take pride in the things that they should be proud of, and to leave behind the things that they should. Of course, it's not perfect, but once again, it's not like, and look, as you all know, I've lost all hope in America ever being a functional country again. It's not like in the U.S. where it's either you had to live completely in the past or you just have to completely tear down the past and leave it all behind. Where once again they found ways to cope and compartmentalize a lot of, let's just say, more brutal and less pleasant times in their history while still honoring what they accomplished. And I think that's a thing that very few nations are capable of. Um, I think China is actually at a crossroads now where they very well could go in the same direction, but I think there's also potential that they could fall into the trap that they've been in for the past, I don't know, half century, where it is where I'm not going to call it complete cultural revolutions, but they are stuck with some residue of the cultural revolution. But I do
Hmm.
think that
Hmm.
they do have the potential to once again grapple with their history the same way the Russians have, and it's very healthy. And I think, and certainly this will play more into when we get to some of the news about France, about Western countries' inability to do this, where they're so they're either once again high on the glory of their past or so guilt ridden about it they're willing to let their nations completely implode.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I've been to Russia, as you know, several times, so I've seen like monuments erected that weren't there the first or second time that I went. Monuments that replaced communist monuments with Orthodox monuments. Like Saint Vladimir, just overlooking the Kremlin. So these change, they're careful to do this, but not in a way that they disturb like a lot of the communist boomers who strongly identify with that period,
Yeah, and then it's also
that have
generational and
good memories of that period, so they have to do it gradually, so they don't like cause waves of discontent and a sense of abandonment in some of them. And
and
it's just it's a gradual process, but it is ongoing.
you might be able to back me up on this, but once again, as you mentioned, it's very much a generational thing. And as that generation, and I'm just speaking objectively, they are very old, as they start to die off in the next 10 to 20 years, to my understanding, a lot of the energy among younger Russians is that more romantic view of the imperial past, which is why you're starting to see
Yeah.
more of a
Yes.
glorification of pre 1917 history. So, especially once again, as there's a generational shift in Russia, you probably will see more of that glorification of pre 1917 history uh,
Yes.
as opposed to Soviet history.
Yeah, and you often see guys on the battlefield with the old imperial flag, the black, gold, and white. I mean, even the guys in Rusich have that flag.
Yeah, I mean, like, of course, unless they're complete like liberals, then they're with that. And not that the liberals are on the battlefield, but speaking in general, they have that stupid color revolution flag without the red stripe. But I mean, ignoring them, and I'm not saying they're insignificant, but they're certainly not the majority. They're look, they have the potential to cause a lot of instability in Russia. There is a real fear of that. But in terms of your average Russian speaking, I would say you're under 50. In terms of the politically and culturally and historically aware ones, I would say that, yeah, there's starting to be more of a romanticism of Russian history in general as opposed to just that narrow Soviet period.
Yeah, and just to round out some of the battlefield news,
Yeah, go ahead.
not necessarily any conflicts, but I mentioned on the last two shows that it seems that the U.S. is replacing, and actually Germany as well. They're replacing or trying to replace lost vehicles, armored vehicles for the Ukrainians. In as I said, in Tokmachka, um, as soon as that happened, the Americans in political said that they're sending over 15 Bradleys. Now they're promising another 30 Bradleys and 20 Strikers. So that gives you an idea, like how much loss there has really been in just a little over 3 weeks of fighting. And if you're on Telegram, I mean, honestly, every morning you're going to see new footage of this happening. It's a tremendous amount of loss, and they're losing the Max Pros as well. The vehicle claimed that it can withstand any bomb, and of course, there was a horrific video of this is just crazy. It's an 11-minute long video, and it's an area that it seems that there are about three Bradleys that have been destroyed, and there are guys who are wounded. This field had personnel mines and mines intended for armor. And it is one of the most gruesome things I've ever seen. Um, but the strange thing is these guys are not like wincing, their faces are not contorted in anguish. So they're on some kind of drugs. One guy jumps out of the Bradley and lands on a mine. I mean, you just later two guys drag him in. Honestly, some of them are crawling to get back into this Bradley.
Now, I'm not going to say this is a practice unique to the U.S. because, I mean, for example, the Germans did in World War II. Use of amphetamines among troops has been something that a lot of countries have done since the mid 20th century. And
Yeah.
especially, I mean, I think the Americans were doing it. I know it was huge in Vietnam, where they would, of course, pump them full of these things. And I think even during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, it was still not uncommon, I'll put it. So,
Hmm.
especially with the deep level of American entrenchment and advisory in this war, the fact that some American general might suggest giving the Ukrainian troops amphetamine is not out of the realm of possibility at all.
Yeah. Now, I don't know if you know, but I think my buddy Romanos knows. And that is these guys. See, there was also an earlier video of guys in a Humvee go over a mine, and it's the view is from inside a Humvee as it happens, and then the guy jumps out of the vehicle, and there are already like three, four other guys that are on the ground in pain, and so on. But the thing is their helmets, they have the blue stripe. Now, when this war started, there were helmets with yellow stripes, like a greenish yellow, like a solid green, deep green yellow, like what you would think of as a true green, and a dark blue stripe. If I'm not mistaken, and I could be wrong, like I say, I think my friend Romanus would know. The blue stripe implies mercenary or like irregular fighting for Ukraine. Green, I know I've seen Azov guys fighting with the green band around their helmet. I think it used to be yellow, but they've switched to green. I don't see the yellow anymore anywhere. So, anyways, if somebody knows, all these guys at this Bradley area of tall grass, they were all wearing the blue, just like the guys that got hit with the Humvees. So I thought that was interesting. The other bit of news is, of course, the Germans also said that they're going to give Ukraine another 14 um, Leopard 2A6 tanks, but not till next year. And there was an interesting article from the Wall Street Journal saying that America is very close to giving ATACMS to the Ukrainians.
Yes, I was actually just
So,
about to bring that up, where the Washington
oh,
Post said
okay.
that for the longest time, Biden hasn't signed off on the ATACMS, the long range missiles that could hit uh, very far behind well into Russian
Hmm.
territory. And it was actually because of Prigozhin's stunt that you have renewed talks in Washington of the signing off of sending ATACMS to Ukraine, because there is at least what was publicly instability in Russia. So, of course, the logic in Washington is strike while the iron is hot, give them the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians might be able to extract some sort of concession, or at least buy time from the Russians in order to prolong this conflict. Because once again,
Hmm.
it's getting to the point, and I know I harp on about this, but I am not sold on, but I am somewhat inclined to believe the Pentagon when they outright said, I believe it was in February this year, that if there is not significant progress on the Ukrainian side by fall, that they're going to press the Ukrainians into talks.
Yes.
And
Hmm.
I think that they don't want to do that. I don't think that Washington has any interest in de escalating this conflict, but in terms of just a pragmatic policy approach, they're starting to run out of options. And as tensions grow in East Asia with the potential of Taiwan or possibly a Korean conflict or just a confrontation involving China, they can't afford to have their attention divided, especially with a war like Ukraine. So they are willing to, like I've been saying, at least shelve this conflict, freeze it over, maybe reignite it when they get the chance. But now that they've at least think they've smelled blood in the water, they're willing to supply the Ukrainians with this, or
Hmm.
are more likely to supply the Ukrainians with this in order to do more damage, in order to provoke a more aggressive response out of Russia, and just ultimately escalate the conflict. And of course, as I have been theorizing, the entrance of Poland and other countries into this war as part of a quote unquote coalition of the willing, their words, not mine, because as the war escalates, as things get more brutal, it creates more and more of, at least on the surface of it, a justifiable situation where a coalition of Poland, Romania, maybe even some of the rabid Chihuahua dogs of the Baltic states can go in and bolster the Ukrainian numbers. With,
Hmm.
and I would say, I'm not saying it's leaps and bounds, but I would imagine the Polish army is probably far more well trained and professional than the Ukrainian army, at least pre-war. Now, of course, the Ukrainians have become battle hardened, but that's also been at a major cost of both men and equipment. But the Poles have been
Hmm.
arming themselves to the teeth years before this war even started, especially with the situation around Kaliningrad. That, yeah, we could potentially see a freeze in the conflict or an escalation or just some way for the Poles to wedge their foot in the door and enter this conflict in some sort of official capacity, even more so than they already are now, because once again, I believe that it's estimated that they have about 20,000 quote unquote volunteers in this war so far, and that's a low bar estimate, and that's not also not including the equipment and other resources that they have contributed to this war effort, because once again, beginning of this war, they gave half their tank fleet. Now, of course, that was a bargaining chip with the West. Give us the Leopards, give us the Abrams, whatever else. And we want a one for one trade because we gave all these old Soviet models to the Ukrainians and we deserve to be compensated for that, blah, blah, blah. But once again, they are looking for an excuse to wedge their foot in the door. And I think they'll find one. And it really comes down to the fact, do the Poles know what they're getting into? Are they willing to stomach the kind of casualties a war like this would carry? And I can't say one way or another. I don't know whether the Poles have that much of a rage against Russia where they are willing to tolerate the kind of losses, maybe not even that Ukraine is taking, but somewhat comparable to what Ukraine is taking. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to say one way or another, but I think there's a real possibility when the body bags start coming home, a lot of Poles, despite whatever negative sentiments they have towards Russia, are going to start second guessing the reason for throwing their men, their boys, into this.
Hmm. Hmm. Yes. Just one final note on Kramatorsk is the two Azov guys, Artem Sukhove and let me get the other guy. Uh, were actually oh yes, and what's his name? Filon, Alexander Filon, were both killed in Kramatorsk. The interesting thing about this place is it was also a place where guys who were leaving Ukraine, had done their, like I'm talking about mercs, where they would leave and they would gather in this area before they would go. But I agree with you about the polls that I mean, they're buying a ton of HIMARS, right? And I don't know if you want to, get into Prigozhin because, of course,
Yeah.
like this kind of ties in with Belarus,
So
right? Because
Man, I can't believe the schizo joke I made last episode might be closer to reality, like far closer to reality
Mm,
than I ever
mm,
imagined.
mm, mm, mm.
Prigozhin becomes a Belarusian warlord and wages war in Poland and the Baltic states. I was kidding. I was kidding. Even though I think he
Yeah.
said he becomes warlord of Kaliningrad, but close enough. Close enough. If that of all predictions turns out to be true, I don't know what to say. I'm not saying my track record for predictions is impeccable. It's certainly better than I would have expected. I still credit myself a lot on predicting the demolition of Nord Stream. That's one thing I will brag about.
Yep.
But
Yep.
like I said, I don't think I think as a program collectively between me and you, we have a very good prediction record. But I'm not going to pretend like I ever. I mean, look, I still am eating my hat over the last what was it, the last summer vidlib. Oh, what a fool I
No, it's
was for
okay.
that one. But I look. I'm going to stand by that. My reasoning was solid. It's just that circumstance didn't play out. And actually, I do have a little bit of news about Syria. I'll get into later in the show. But to get into some of the Prigozhin news and the alleged, oh, is it confirmed that Sotovikin was arrested, or is that just still in the
No,
rumor
no,
mill?
no, no. That was all bullshit. Okay,
Yeah,
so
that's what I thought.
right. Okay, so uh it was the Times of Moscow, which is it's not like it's a Western paper. It's not a Russian paper. Like it sounds like I didn't know, kind of like the Times of London. It sounds like the New York Times, etc. Does have that ring to it, right? But this was a paper that was free. Like you could, if you're in one of the Moscow Metro, it's no, I haven't been there in a while, but you could just get this paper for free. It's like the Metro paper in Canada and in Britain. I don't know if you guys have them, but like they're just free newspapers, right? And it's mostly all propaganda. Uh, so the thing about Prigozhin, obviously, and we talked about it in the last show, is that it's not just Surovikin that knew what his plans were. Like Putin knew what his plans were, right? You know, there was a stand down order, right? Like you cannot amass 8,000 guys and hundreds of vehicles. Like the planning to do that takes days, right? Like we talk about this being the most surveilled war ever. That kind of movement, everybody knows at least a few days ahead of time. But now you have like articles from the Washington Post saying the US knew months in advance. Well, if they knew months in advance, well, then so did the Russians, right? And so what the Moscow Times tried to do was get people to believe that Surovikin, because he knew, he was probably in on it, and he tried to topple Putin. There's a lot of things about this case that still make no sense, and the more you see the way the West reacts to Prigozhin and Wagner's move to Belarus, the more you have to kind of rethink why the West is so concerned about these guys being there. I mean, if these guys almost had a successful coup, because like if you watch the videos, especially when they were leaving Rostov the Sunday night, people love them. And they're saying all kinds of things. We love Wagner, and we love Putin. We love Russia. This is the Patrick Lancaster video. It's about a half an hour long, and he puts the mic to Prigozhin, and not much is said. He's basically asking, "Что результат? What is the result of all this?" And Prigozhin says, "It's good energy. It's everything is fine." And then he says, like, "It was Utkin's idea." Like it's, you know what I mean? Like the stuff that doesn't make sense. So like, if I'm not saying it wasn't Utkin's idea. I'm not saying it was Prigozhin's idea. We don't know. They're just saying stuff. We're never going to know, probably, right? But if you go with the premise that this guy had an intent to overthrow the military command, thus bypassing Putin, or maybe had bigger plans, ousting Putin,
Oh no.
Lukashenko, this is so hilarious. Lukashenko said, "Oh my God, this is so comical." If Prigozhin said if he was successful, he'd make Lukashenko president of Russia. Oh my God. Oh, get real. Like, this is so ridiculous. It's so comical.
But I do
Oh,
have to
what a
say in
teach.
all of this, I think my biggest takeaway from the Prigozhin exile right here is
Yeah,
that, of course, there's been talks for years, and especially in the past couple of years, a lot more legitimately, of Russian Belarusian integration. And I think we're seeing right
yeah,
now the utility of Belarus as a proxy state. That
yes,
there's a
yes.
lot you can funnel through them, and that while ultimately Russia probably will have to completely integrate with Belarus, there's still a lot of
Yeah.
utility they can get out of them being a technically independent country, where they can send Prigozhin, where they can have Lukashenko be a middleman and a negotiator and do these sort of things. I mean, even going all the way back to the Minsk agreement, that was
Hmm.
in Minsk, Belarus. Lukashenko and his people helped put together the tentative treaty that at least staved off war for about 8 years. Now, again, can talk about the Minsk agreement and how good of an idea that actually was, but that's aside the point. But Belarus has proven itself indispensable. In which case,
Oh yeah.
they've probably, and Lukashenko in particular, has probably delayed full integration of the quote unquote union state by at least a decade. I would say.
Yes, I think so. Maybe he was behind it because, of course, this is. Oh, he's the master. He's the puppet master. He was all along. Um, because everybody knows, like, he ran for president of Russia and Belarus at the same time before Putin's time. Like, oh my God, he's so ambitious.
Yeah, and then there was
This
there was
ambitious
the
potato farmer. So, like,
he spearheaded the '94 referendum to reunite the two countries as well while running for president of both countries. It
yeah,
was look. There's a lot you can say about him. I know a lot of Russians that have a great distaste for him for I would say plenty of valid reasons, but the
yeah.
man, at least for me, is too comical to hate.
Yes. I know they dislike him because he's cringe and comical, but not in a good way. For them, I get where they're coming from, but for us, it's hilarious. I mean, we're in the West, right? So there's just,
I mean, he's
you
perfect for
know,
Belarus. I'll put it that way. He's perfect for that proxy state that Russia has to launder stuff through.
yes, I can cynically see that, but we're too Western. It's too much. It's too much about the irony, right? It's like what helps us survive.
We've been massacring the scum you've been financing.
if, if you don't laugh, you cry. Like that's
Yeah.
irony gets us there. But there is an interview with that guy Dmitry Gordon and Lukashenko from a few years ago that I discovered, and he talks about he knows Prigozhin, and he gets the sense, he said, that somebody else is controlling Prigozhin. Like, he's always trying to build this intrigue, and he says, so Moscow thought they could just take us and plant us as one of their little towers and in the Kremlin, and it, it's kind of weird seeing that in hindsight. But to get to my original point, so if these guys are dangerous, right? If they kind of almost succeeded in taking over, um, if you follow the Western narrative, over at least the military command, right? And they're hugely popular. Putin's power is compromised. It's teetering. Wouldn't putting them in Belarus increase the chances? So if that's the case, why did Poland, Lithuania, Germany, and France all like Germany has moved now 4,000 troops permanently into Lithuania on the border of Belarus. Morawiecki said that he's sending troops to the border of Belarus. Like, if Prigozhin is a destabilizer, right? Because everything he said, like, you know, he was he was being forthright about it. I mean, sure, the attack on his base was a lie, but he needed it to get the ball rolling, and
I
you
mean,
know,
to get to your
it
point,
was Shoigu and it was Shoigu and Gerasimov that lied to Putin and got this war started. Ukraine was never like if that's the case. I mean, he repeated every single Western talking point you could imagine, right? Like if that's the case, right, then putting him in Belarus should be a good thing, right?
Oh,
But their
absolutely.
reaction is that now Belarus is more dangerous because of Prigozhin and Wagner there. And of course, now you have like a Belarusian general saying, we should work with Wagner would help our military, right? Now consider that Belarus has a very high proportion of fighters that are fighting on behalf of Kiev, right? Because the Soviet Union couldn't get rid of like the Nazi collaborators and Belarusian and Ukrainian nationalists who were in Belarus, right? And as far as I know, Lukashenko's last name is a Ukrainian last
Oh,
name.
absolutely.
Yeah, so um, it took until 1952 to get rid of them, right? And they have a very high portion. Like Canadians and Belarusians are amongst the countries that have the most amount of mercenaries in Ukraine right now. Like far higher per capita than the Americans.
Wow, even the
Far,
Poles and the
far higher.
Georgians. Wow, that's
Yeah.
shocking. But
So
but
like
yeah,
if
getting
that's the
get
case, and we know Wagner has like a lot of right wing elements, Utkin, everybody's seen those photos of Utkin with like certain tattoos from the mid-century Germans on his upper chest and collarbones. Like, wouldn't that be dangerous? But you look at the way the West is reacting to it, and they're reacting to it like, um, they're afraid of their presence there. So this whole thing with Prigozhin to me makes no sense. He's either completely insane, like in a state of euphoria, um, and denial at the same time, and he's sputtering one thing and then another in order to keep his advantage. Like, well, it this angle of we shouldn't have gone into this war, but now we're in it, and it's Shoigu that's to blame. The Ukrainians weren't so bad. I'll switch it up and say, no, we're not attacking hard enough. Like, you know what I mean? Like his narrative switched
yeah,
several times in those 24 hours.
and ultimately getting at your point, what you were saying earlier about Prigozhin and the alleged threat he presents in Belarus, it should be the West should be elated that he's building an army in exile in
Yeah,
Belarus that's going to march on
yeah,
Moscow again, probably much more successfully if we're to believe all the Western narratives. And then also to touch, you have to remember a lot of the failed color revolutionaries from 2020 in Belarus were funneled into Ukraine at the start of this war, and actually probably even a little bit before then. Because where else do they have to go? That's where they went into exile, and that's where they get a lot of these elements. And you've been seeing a lot more of the color revolution Belarus flag, the one that is white with the red stripe in it. Yeah,
yeah,
that's been all over these uniforms. That you've found these flags everywhere, and once again, that is the Belarusian opposition flag. So it's not shocking that what you end up with is this, and they should be elated that he's going to get all these Belarusian dissidents and march on Moscow and form a counter army in Ukraine and switch sides in the war like some sort of insane warlord with very fickle loyalties. But ultimately,
yeah.
once again, I don't think he's really going to do anything one way or another, but just his presence in Belarus seems to terrify the West, in which case I think they realize that Belarus is that Russian proxy, especially at this point, where yeah, he can build up an army and do some extra legal things on behalf of the Russians. Probably still has some loyalty to the war effort. I know he's a bit of a BS artist and will flip flop on his narrative, but point being is even in his disgraced state, he probably still has quite a bit of value to Russia, particularly in this war effort. Even just as again a doomsday device, somebody they can use to raise up fear in the Baltic states, Poland, etc. So I wouldn't be surprised if he's kept on a shorter leash by the Belarusians, but is allowed to make, let's just say, more absurd statements. Now, maybe not even act on them, but just have him being a rabid dog barking on the border of Lithuania and Poland and the other Baltic states, etc. I think is actually probably what we're going to see out of Prigozhin's future, if I had to take a guess.
Well, you know who thinks that Prigozhin is will try to take power back in Moscow again?
Hold on.
Strelkov.
Oh,
Sorry, I couldn't resist.
I was gonna guess
Sorry.
Gunther Fehlinger.
Yeah, so Strelkov is back at it again.
uh,
Here's why I'm indispensable, and I should be given a much higher position than,
yeah.
a boomer complaining constantly. I mean, not that some of his predictions have been wrong, but he like I don't always trust his motives either. And like I say, it's not that there aren't good points. Um, it's just that I'm weary of him, right? Um, remember when he went to the front and then like a month later he just went back home.
Yeah. Uh, he's gotten a bit fickle in old age. He's not the Strelkov he was in 2014, who was organizing the separatists. So, look, I'll never take that away from him. I'll never take away the great things he did for the people of Eastern
Yeah.
Ukraine. But after a certain point, you have to realize he's lost a lot of his luster.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, his problem was Prigozhin's problem, if you take Prigozhin's word for it, with Moscow, and that was they wanted the war to go a certain way, and Moscow didn't. And for that matter, there was a Ukrainian who recently said that this was the case with the Ukrainians. They had like these war bands that were created because the Ukrainian army was not like functioning very well. Part of it is because the Ukrainian army regulars did not want to fight like other fellow Ukrainians or Ukrainians that identified as part of the greater Russian world. And a lot of them defected as well, like entire brigades defected along with their equipment. So it took a while for the nationalists and for the mercenaries to get in to Ukraine in order to like save the day and take back towns like Bakhmut and Slavyansk, right? Um, so that's just something to consider. Um, and I think the problem is also Putin. uh, Putin had a ceremony in the cathedral section of the Kremlin. I could be wrong, but I think some of the guys from Wagner were there, like that didn't go along with this. He was presenting medals. I think it was also to like regular Russian soldiers that were fighting, and some news started to trickle out because Putin made some statements about like how the funding went, and apparently Prigozhin, who's this caterer, right, and Lukashenko in his interview with Dmitry Gordon, mentions that he's a caterer. And so Prigozhin, like his contract is to supply all schools, school lunches, and he got the contract for the Russian military, I believe, even before the SMO. And it was the Russian military, the Russian government, who was paying Wagner, right? So, um, of course, they signed into law that back in the spring that Wagner could no longer recruit from prisons. But then a few weeks later or a month later, the Russians made a law that the Russian army could recruit from prisons. Now, the amount of prisoners who want to go and fight for the Russian army is very low. It's only like 2,000 guys, and if they sign on, they sign on until the war is over, which is insane. But Wagner, I think it was a 6-month tour, 6 months, and then you can go home. So yeah, very different. And the Russian army has already started to integrate some of the trainers and fighters from Wagner into their own military. And History Legend actually had a video on this and they're called something like Z Force, and they've been using them to fight, particularly in the Zaporozhye region, but that's not it, but not exclusively there. So, I mean, July 1st is the deadline, right? Like the decision was already made to incorporate Wagner, like because everything they have is, or virtually everything they had in this theater is given to them by the Russian military, right? I'm not saying that's the case in Africa, where they work to protect Chinese and Russian gold mines. I think they make their own money there, but this is a whole other scale in comparison.
Absolutely, and as you said with Wagner and its operations outside of Russia and Ukraine, once again, they're still going to be indispensable in places like Syria and the various African, Middle Eastern interests that Russia has. And my, I guess you could call it prediction, for lack of a better word, is that we'll see a lot of it rolled into the Ministry of Defense, but we will see Wagner probably split up or reorganized into a different mercenary outfit who will assume
Mhm.
these roles. Maybe some other caterer has Putin's political favor that he's willing to give a mercenary, at least ownership of a mercenary army to the point where he can reorganize these things. Because I doubt these guys are just going to pack up and go home or just get integrated into the Russian army proper. Even though somebody did point out, and I'm not sure how much I sign on to this comparison, but I do think it's worth mentioning. Well, before we move on to some of the stuff about France and Europe in general, but they said that in many ways, Azov and Tornado and whatever names that a lot of these Ukrainian paramilitary groups had at the outbreak of the Donbass War in 2014 were rolled into the proper Ukrainian armed forces
Yeah.
and were integrated into certain units and used to bolster the armed forces as a whole, which is the reason why, for many people, the Ukrainian armed forces overperformed at the beginning of the war and seemed a lot more competent than maybe they would have been otherwise. And some speculate that that is the fate of Wagner, that they will be dispersed
Hmm.
amongst
Hmm.
the Russian military proper in order to raise that up. And I think quite a bit of it will happen that way. But once again, because Russia is a world power with these interests in the Middle East, Africa, and elsewhere, they're going to need mercenary outfits to take care of the deployments that you don't necessarily want to send your regular army in for, to defend these mines, to defend these ports, etc., etc. In which case, I don't think they'll be called Wagner anymore because I think the name is tarnished because of this little stunt. But they will be rolled into some new mercenary outfit in
Yeah, it's
in my
possible, and they
estimation.
will, I think, still work under the Wagner name, but outside
Yeah,
of Russia.
yeah. In which case, I think that's the way the U.S. operates. What does Eric Prince call his outfit now? I know it was Blackwater for the longest time. Didn't he like go for? He changed it to something really stupid a few years back. I can't remember the name for it, but Blackwater for the sake of
Yeah, yeah,
just
yeah.
the sake of simplicity. We're to the point where they officially don't operate in the U.S. I actually don't believe they operate in the U.S. because I think there's other much more effective means of control by the U.S. regime, but they take care of a lot of these extra legal deployments in other parts of the world as well. So Wagner will probably become much like that under the Wagner name, or like I said, with the potential of it being reorganized and rebranded, but fundamentally serving the same role and purpose.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I still think, and a lot of people don't buy it. You know, there was, I'm talking about Prigozhin. A lot of people don't buy the story. You know, I think it was interesting that on Saturday, as soon as this thing fizzled out, there were already articles, um, you know, from CNN, New York Times, Washington Post saying, this may not be what you think it is. Sky News had an article that had words to that effect. Um, you know, the Americans were saying, like, articles came out that the Biden administration had told various Western leaders to not talk about this. Of course, that raises suspicion that maybe Prigozhin was in talks with them. Remember, there were those articles in April saying that they had spoken to them. The Discord leaks claim that they had spoken to them, and back, I think, in February, it was either Wesley Clark or Petraeus who, in an interview, I think it was with Newsweek, who said, we have our own operatives in there. Y- you know, um, Assassination is not out of the question. Uh, you know, Not echoing Lindsey Graham, but Lindsey Graham kind of echoing them. Um, I still like. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this because he goes into Rostov on Don. Uh, I don't know for sure, but Shoigu and Gerasimov leave before he arrives, and like nothing happens. Like the lines, all the lines are stable. Um, Prigozhin even at one point says the lines are stable. This is the same guy who says also Tokmak is taken, Melitopol is about to fall. Like crazy stuff, right? I can't help but think that some of this has to be a stunt. I just, it makes no sense to me. The only other explanation is he's a guy who's losing it, and he thought this would succeed. And at one, and like, un, unlike some people, he figures out that it's not going to succeed, that there's too much to lose. So he tells his men, and you have to understand, like, there's only 2,000 guys that are moving towards Moscow with anywhere from 150 to 170 vehicles. That's become clear. At first, people were saying there were like 400 vehicles, but um, also just because some tragedies did happen and they have been acknowledged. So the the Russian government and the Russian MOD have said that 12 were killed, and that there was fakery. There was an Mi-28 that apparently was shot down, and the photo of it is like none of the blades are damaged. There's no skid marks. None of the earth has been overturned. Right? It's just burning. Right? Like also, you don't know if in during all of this, maybe the Ukrainians shot some of these aircraft down. I don't know, but like that one particular photo of the Mi-28 to me is extremely sus. It has a pair of tracks that go to it, almost like it was put there and then it was just lit on fire. Very different than the Ka-52, the Ka-52 that was destroyed, right? Um, so there's something very odd about this. We can say that both the Americans and the Russians are saying they knew months in advance of what Prigozhin's intent was. So if it's like not 100% psyop, it has the qualities that all psyops have, which is foreknowledge and containing the event because you know what they're going to do. That's what I think happened in Turkey in 2016. I think Erdogan knew what was happening, right? What the intent was. And this is how they could um, outmaneuver the various groups that were trying to do this, to overthrow him. There always has to be some guys that like really fundamentally believe that this is going to work in order for this to develop the way it does. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think in terms of at least the available information, all that can be said about Prigozhin's stunt has been said by us at least. But of
Yeah.
course, we will keep you informed with any new developments around that because you pretty much said everything I could have said. So I'll just shelve this topic for now, and I'm sure we will hear more about this in the future, in which case we will get on that as soon as we can. And for the interest of time, because I probably have another, let's just say, about 45 minutes to an hour,
Mhm.
uh, which I think is plenty, I'm just going to breeze over some news out of Syria before we get into some of the stuff about France. So, Syria and the Middle East in general. So, we do have a reinforcement by Syrian troops along the Turkish border as negotiations begin in Kazakhstan, mediated by the Russians and the Kazakhs. We also have the U.S. moving a permanent deployment of F 22s into Jordan to quote unquote counter Russia's unprofessional behavior in Syria, in which case they want that counterbalance there for obvious reasons, in which case we may see another escalation in Syria to try to draw Russian attention away from the current war effort. I'm not saying that's a
Mhm.
certainty, but it is a possibility that we do have to look out for. But it is an interesting reversal of the trend in the Middle East, which we've seen the U.S. withdrawing from and pulling back from, that we're re-entrenching ourselves in particularly Jordan at a time like this. Not even Qatar, not even Bahrain or Saudi Arabia. Of course, not Saudi Arabia with the direction things are going right now. But as I've said for many years, Jordan is the most malleable country in the region. They can be swayed to loyalty to any side. Not to mention it's right next to Israel too, so that's also convenient real estate for that. But the U.S. is keeping their deployments in Jordan for obvious reasons, in which case we may expect to see escalations in Iraq and Syria, especially as the situations there unfold, especially involving Turkey. There were also in Iraq protests and attacks outside of the Swedish embassy because of the Quran burnings in Sweden. Because apparently, if you just burn the Quran, that takes care of mass migration. It's wild how that works. It
Mm,
it,
yeah,
it
yeah,
works
yeah.
every time, right? Yeah. If we just own the Muslims hard enough, they'll just go home. It never works, by the way. it's it. What may have been edgy and controversial in 2004 is just it's just so performative right now. 20 years later, there's
Yeah.
nobody is taken in by this anymore. It's just edgy right wingers doing this in lieu of actually accomplishing anything of significance. That's
But remember, we always said that some token victories would be given to them out of necessity, right? To feel like the West is moving on their side, that they're going to be needed. And if they're going to be needed, well, then uh some allowances have to be made, right? Like,
of course with the
re
exact opposite
remember
situation happening in France.
Maloney is promised to stem migration. She didn't, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like,
and then she blamed Wagner for mass migration because
yeah, yeah,
that's the
yeah.
next
It's
logical
so
move.
stupid. But what, I mean, what can she do? Like, I mean, the largest American naval base outside of America is in, if I'm not mistaken, is in Italy. It's huge, right? Like, you can't, like, they're not free
Look,
countries.
I'm talking about a country and a people that is a significant amount of my ancestry when I'm talking about Italy, so I'm not saying this with any vitriol at all. But
Hmm.
once again, it's as colonized as Germany. It's a second-rate power. It has been since unification. And look, as much as I love the culture and the people there, and in fact, I actually visited there at the beginning of this year. Beautiful country. I would recommend if you ever get the chance, go over there. But at the end of the day, this isn't a country that's going to exercise its sovereignty against the American empire. And frankly, even in a post-American order, it's probably not going to be a major player. I mean, look, there's a lot of good things about it. It's certainly culturally right now far less degraded and far better off than the Anglosphere. I will never take that away from them. But at the end of the day, we have to realize that this country is as much a colony as, say, Germany is.
Mm.
But to continue on with the Middle Eastern news, there was a firefight outside of the U.S. consulate in Saudi Arabia in Jeddah. Now, as to the group being attributed to this, there isn't much information. Just that there were shots exchanged between U.S. security forces and um, some group within Saudi Arabia. Funny enough, the OPEC summit has closed out reporters from Bloomberg, Reuters, and the Wall Street Journal, and they didn't give a reason for the decision, and they this is the second time they've closed them out in the course of a month. So OPEC, which was originally created, funny enough, to counter the Soviet oil market, is completely in league with the Russians now. Which you have to love that. You have to love the complete turning in on its head of of OPEC and its intended purposes to the point where it has become just a complete detriment to American imperial interests, and yet it once again it's not something that the U.S. can just wave a hand and be done with like it could have, say, with Iraq or Libya back in 2003, 2011, whatever it might have been. And just one last thing before I get into some of the France stuff is we do have some news out of Armenia that the U.S. is mediating talks between Armenia and Azerbaijan as we speak, and the negotiations aren't seeing much of anything really. It's a show. It's a token effort that's being made on the part of all sides involved, whether it be Pashinyan's Color Revolution government that seems hell bent on selling the Armenian nation and people down a river, on the Azeris who are just biding their time, knowing that ultimately when they get the chance they're probably going to crush Armenia. And I say that with no pleasure at all. I do not want the Azeris to win this war or any similar conflict. And then the Americans trying to scrape together what little international credibility they have left by quote unquote mediating a conflict in the Caucasus, while of course being one of the biggest instigators of the conflict in Ukraine right now. So trying to regain any sort of credibility and also probably get a foothold in the Caucasus, if we're being honest. And really, there's not going to be any breakthrough with this, unfortunately. And time is on Azerbaijan's side with the way
Yeah.
everything is set up right now. And the failure to remove Pashinyan at this point, as much as I hate to say it, I think it's a foregone conclusion that Armenia is just screwed. There's really nothing more you can say about it at that point.
Yeah. It's a sad truth.
And I don't know, maybe their diaspora in Russia or wherever else or Iran will be able to pull enough strings in order to uh, at least save somewhat of Armenia. I know that the Iranians have, even just for pragmatic interests against the Azeris and their alliance with Israel, have been very supportive of the Armenians lately. They might be able to bail them out to a degree, but we'll ultimately have to see what really comes of that. Or who the hell knows? China might come in and make a
Hmm.
sweetheart deal for both sides, like they've done in several places over the past few years, because China is being viewed as more and more of a reputable mediator in these sort of conflicts. As we've seen with Saudi Arabia and Iran, has been a massive boost to the prestige of China, even though it's not finalized yet. The fact that they have come this close after this many decades, once again, in terms of Chinese foreign policy, when you're looking at the quote unquote neutral and unaligned world, that is a massive boost to China's reputation and prestige on the global stage. So, uh,
Hmm.
uh, like I said, maybe they can negotiate something. It's far from Russia's priority, despite the fact that the Caucasus is right in its backyard. It has, even in the Caucasus, far bigger concerns such as preventing another escalation with Georgia and the two breakaway republics of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, where unfortunately, and the Armenians, who then no, look, I'm not going to blame the Armenians, the people who Pashinyan's government, who time and time again worked to stifle any cooperation and help the Russians have offered him to this point. So, like I said, there's only so many ways I can say Armenia is just screwed for the time being. As much as I wish it weren't the case, that is currently the reality of the situation, and I really don't see it improving anytime soon, even with the removal of Pashinyan at this point, because he's done too much damage. And like I said, perhaps the Armenians in the diaspora have enough weight to pull wherever, but it's a long shot to say the least.
Yeah. I wish there was another way. I can't say I don't despise Azerbaijan for this because I mean, I get it. They lost that war after the fall of the Soviet Union, and so they feel like there's a chunk of the country that's been cut off. But on the other hand, it doesn't seem like they're willing to just have like a thoroughfare that they can go back and forth without a problem.
And
I
once
feel
again,
like
I will admit
they're
that
more ambitious.
fully that my position in the Armenian Azeri conflict is completely ideological and completely like personal bias in my analysis, and I'm sure you all know that. Um,
Yeah.
and honestly, look, I'm not as I'm sure you know, I'm not a guy who's really big on immigration of any kind, uh, even of quote unquote compatible groups. But I think there's a fair case for. I don't think emigration of Armenians to places like Europe and maybe even the U.S. Would be that much of a problem. I do think that they're generally a people that can assimilate and lead normal and upright lives in the West and in Europe in general. So I wouldn't be opposed to facilitating emigration if it comes to that, honestly.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't be opposed to other nations doing that because I think, like I said, they're not the greatest people in the world, but I think the Armenians in general are like a good people who don't bring social ills to a nation, maybe unlike some other groups that emigrate. But again, that's getting a bit lost in the minutia. But I suppose we can wrap up the show with some takes on BLM French edition.
Yeah.
And I think
Crazy.
my short summary right there tells you all you need to know. But it just in general, it like I said, it reads. If you were to change a few names and details, it reads like a BLM story. French
Yeah.
authorities use deadly force on an Algerian migrant committing a violent crime, and now the migrant populations in France are in full scale riot against the authorities. And this far surpasses anything that the Yellow Vest did or that any of the recent protests over the retirement age and the pension programs did. This far surpasses it. I mean, you have some places where the French authorities are overwhelmed, where I know a lot of the times the police will stand down in solidarity with the protesters, but you have right now police standing down because they don't stand a chance against the way these protesters are behaving. That they're actually needing to break out some of the heavier stuff, like proper anti-riot forces, in order to deal with the situation in France right now. It's honestly, I know France. It's become a bit of a running joke that they have the routine riots, but it is beyond anything we've seen. And
Hmm.
it was actually interesting because
Yeah.
there were some interviews with a French riot control man, French riot control police officer, who said that the feeling on the ground among the police and the military that have been deployed to contain the situation is that the politicians are completely fine with letting this go on and they have no desire to solve this. Like I said, it reads if you were to replace, um, of course, Black Americans speaking purely neutrally with Algerians. This feels like stories you would have read about BLM in 2020, like to a T.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. I mean, I just saw a video from there, and we have to stress this is all across the country. It is not just cities like, say, Paris and Lyon, or Strasbourg. This is Lille, in the north, a much smaller city. It is very, very widespread. And I saw, like, a trucker, a lorry driver, dragged out of the van, I mean, out of his truck. And this guy, I don't know if it's a door to another vehicle, he just clobbers him over the head with it. And this, like, these maniacs have surrounded him, right? Um, this is all, it's racial.
Oh, absolutely.
Um, yeah, absolutely.
And
This
actually,
whole thing is.
I was telling you about this off air, and I haven't seen anyone mention this, so I want to mention it to see whether I have this confused with something else or I've just completely lost the plot. To see if any of you remember what I'm talking about. I think it was about a year ago, summer 2022, where Netflix, and I don't know whether they actually went through with the production, put out this trailer
Mhm.
about this like alternate near future where in France, because of racial and ethnic discrimination, uh, the Algerians, the whoever in France, rise up and try to take down the government and clash with the authorities. Pretty much a show about a impending French Civil War, like in the late 2020s, 2030s. And like I said, I know you didn't know what I was talking about, but I can. I may have it confused with something else. I'm fully willing to admit that I might just have things mixed up here, but I want to see if anyone else knows what I'm talking about. Where and once again, that gets in the conversation if that is real, the thing about predictive programming, which I'm not saying I buy completely into, but there's some strange things about that. And maybe it just
Hmm.
it takes,
Hmm.
or maybe it's just the slightest amount of foresight where it's realizing that hey, this is going to reach a breaking point and eventually it's going to boil over. Or perhaps you could also look at this where uh, look, we all know who controls the media and for what means. And I actually don't even mean it in the way that most people do. Like, of course, I do mean it in that way, but I'm thinking a little bit more, uh, digging a little bit deeper beyond that.
Hmm.
And I mean, it could be the fact that they want to egg this on, that they want to implant these ideas in the population, because people are very malleable, even when it comes to quote unquote fictional media, where they will internalize these ideas. So perhaps that was part of it. Not to mention, I also think it has to do with the general Americanization of culture. So when you have these people in France, particularly of a non ethnic French background, watching what happens in the U.S. because of so-called discrimination and police brutality, and a similar incident happens 3 years later, they start to emulate the behaviors that they've seen out of America, especially considering the fact the degree of success the let's just say summer of peace, the summer of love of 2020 had with the removal of Trump from office, with the complete gutting of several police departments across the country, with the relative impunity a lot of petty criminals can operate with now in most major cities. Once again, I as an outsider looking at it, I can imagine nothing but stunning success. So if you're somebody in France with an agenda,
Hmm.
or if you're one of these foot soldiers who internalizes everything, the summer 2020 riots look like something that can be very easily emulated to accomplish your goals. And actually, something interesting that I haven't noticed, maybe it's just because I haven't seen it yet. I'm not saying it didn't happen, but from all the footage I've seen so far, whereas in the U.S. you had a coalition of course, the BLM people, and then like the Antifa and the various leftists of no particular racial background, where again it was like white, Hispanic, Asian, like pretty much everyone who was in support of the quote unquote leftist cause. It sort of metastasized from BLM just into leftist violence in general. I haven't seen that in France yet. I'm not saying it hasn't happened or that it won't happen, but so far what I've seen, it's broken down on pretty much ethnic, national, and racial lines so far. Uh, I could be wrong about that, and it could just be because this is early. But yeah, I haven't seen any, for example, like French far leftists or Antifa types participating in this sort of unrest and violence. Now, I could be wrong, but I mean, this is the culmination of what's been happening in Europe since at least 2015. I think it really comes down to that. And this is really the first event of this kind that we've seen. Now you can point to things like the Cologne New Year's Eve incident either in 2015, 2016. I'm sure you all remember the one I'm talking about.
Hmm.
That was probably the last case of major violence related to the migrant crisis that I can think of. Of course, there's been a myriad of individual cases, including up until very recently, and in France for that matter. I think it was about 6 months to a year ago. I can't remember exactly when we covered that one story about the 11-year-old child that I frankly don't want to get back into the details of. I'd rather not recall that in that intensive detail. But yeah, you've seen these small individual things, and then you've seen the quote unquote backlash from the far right, which is usually either just completely fabricated or blown completely out of proportion and a complete misconstruing of what actually happened. But it's full on BLM style riots in France right now, and it doesn't look like these are coming to an end. And I know a lot of people hear riots in France, as I said before, and think, oh, they'll fizzle out after a few days. But once again, that's usually the French people are rioting because that's just become an acceptable form of protest. They'll go out, they'll have their day jobs, they'll go out riot on the nights and weekends, and then go home until the government offers whatever trinket concession it does. But looking at the nature of what we saw now, especially with the racial, ethnic, and national elements tied into this, I don't think it's going to be that. I think this is going to be something that is going to be a much more long lasting thing because it's not like the ethnic French population who views just the riots as a national pastime. These are people who are out for a real, just complete overturning and who are willing to use those extreme methods to do so.
Yeah, I saw a very interesting video. Um, from a few days ago. Um, I wish I could remember right now his name. I think it's Oz or something. He's an older British gentleman, and he was citing a European that had come to America to describe the differences between, America and Europe. And he says, words to the effect: in Europe, you can have decline, and in Europe, you have tradition. You have a kind of a network of people and conformities. He doesn't use conformities as a word uh, that kind of hold things together. In America, those things aren't there. What you have is an amazing amount of freedom, and particularly freedom to move. He says, but what keeps America together is religion. And it seems unlikely. Remember, this is 123 years ago that America would ever lose religion. But if it did, it would have the most total revolution.
Oh, absolutely. And I
And
remember,
I think
I,
I
I
think
remember,
the
yeah, what you're
Americanization of
talking about.
Europe describes this. We saw it happen in America, and now America exports it all over the world. And this is why, the gay flag is America's imperial flag, right? Because all gays around the world understand that if America falls, they go down with it.
Yeah, once again, they've made themselves an indispensable fifth column in any given nation that they're in, that they are the pro
Absolutely.
Washington lobby in that nation. And once again, a lot of people just view it as a purely ideological thing, in which case I do think there are a lot of true believers in the State Department in Washington and this sort of stuff, but there's also plenty of
Mhm.
cynics who are willing to just go the extra mile with this, realizing that, well, if you can create these very obscure and niche identities, whether that be because the LGBTQ CIA stuff, or even, once again, like on an ethnic level too, and I think the Kurds are a prime example of this, if you can make yourself indispensable in that way, Washington will never forsake you. But conversely, you're completely reliant on the American empire for your existence, which, I mean, that's exactly where they want you, to the point where you will go to the full lengths to Americanize your nation, to act completely within the interest, take your marching orders directly from Washington. And yeah, again, that's what it all comes down to. And yeah, I'm glad you brought up that one study, because I can't
Mhm.
remember where but I think you had sent that to me at some point about how the common unifying factor in
Yes,
America
I did
was,
send it to
yeah,
you.
yeah, you did, uh, was religiosity. And once that implodes, or if that were to implode, as somebody saying it 123 years ago, America just has unchecked revolutionary power. And especially with the secularization and deracination of Europe, as at least demographically, I would say it starts to resemble more and more of America. Now, I think quite a few parts of Europe have a much brighter demographic future in that regard, but once again, the gap is closing very quickly. But yeah,
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
combined with the secularization, especially with a lot of these migrants coming from the Islamic world, who, although a lot of them also do secularize, a lot of them also do stick very closely to their Islamic beliefs. That creates just a whole new dynamic of it, because you have these either atheistic or nominally Christian Europeans who don't really give much stock to religious or much, again, the higher questions, as much as they might like to pride themselves as intellectuals, some of them at least.
Yeah.
Whereas you have people who genuinely believe in this religion with their heart and soul coming in, organizing, and conducting these kind of actions on their streets. And at the end of the day, it's not a contest. I'm not rooting for them. Don't get me wrong. Don't take it that
Yeah.
way at all. But at the end of the day, you can see the momentum. You can see which side has more wind behind its sails. And like I said, I'm
Mhm.
saying that purely objectively. I wish the Europeans would have more ethnic consciousness and more religiosity. I think that would be a very positive
Yeah.
thing for
I
them.
mean,
I mean, look at where it got them for centuries, and to forsake all of that, I mean, we're looking at the result of it.
well, I mean, um, they're all their young leaders are trained in America, right?
Oh, absolutely. And
If you
if
if you imitate America, you will lose your ethnic and cultural identity.
absolutely, and the ones that aren't trained in
And
America are trained by American exported educators. That's really all it comes down to.
yeah,
Because I mean, all the
yeah.
prestigious universities in Europe at this point, if they aren't directly, if the faculty there isn't directly American educated. They're educated by somebody who was educated in America to the point where I would say, yeah, post World War II, that was sort of a foregone conclusion. Where and even a little bit before, where these ideas trickled out of America, and before then they were trickling out of Britain, which I mean was a more moderated form of, let's just say,
Yeah.
the ideological strain coming out of America. But once again, once it got to America, it
It
fell
was
victim.
tempered by tradition again,
Yeah, it
by
fell it.
norms and tradition
Yeah, and
to
especially
to
in
to
yeah, I get what you're saying. Yeah, because the British still had a sense of themselves when they were exporting these ideas, but when it got to America, it bred with that unchecked revolutionary power, and we're seeing the consequences of that right now.
yes. Yeah.
But ultimately, I mean, there's a lot of ways this could go because I I've often said that the
Yeah.
French are simultaneously the people of Europe that I have the most and least hope for, and that just depends on how they react to a situation like this. Now, the situation is far too new to know what their full response is going to be, but I mean, ultimately, this is. I think it was September of either. Was it September 2021 or September 2022 where those 20 retired military officers wrote the letter saying that if you don't get a grip on the migration situation, that, hey, this exact situation actually will happen.
Yeah. And just to go back to the similarities, wasn't there a little girl named Lola that was killed
Yeah, that's the one I
recently
was
in
talking about
France?
earlier.
Oh yes, that's right. Lola, yeah. And of course, right, like I mean, we've seen this pattern before. We've seen it in Britain, you know.
I know there's that particularly
Don't look
gruesome one out of
don't look
Ireland.
back in
Like,
anger. And of course, the French government has already had like vigils for this boy, right?
yeah.
And his mom is like already like she's in the streets and she's got on top of a motorcycle and revved it and like this crowd is like cheering her on. It's
Well,
just
textbook BLM stuff. Like,
yeah, it's very BLM. It looks so much like BLM. I mean, you even saw BLM shit going down in the UK, right? I mean, it was going on here in Canada, but not like it was pretty peaceful, to be honest. But
yeah, the Canadians are pretty.
when the Indian graves, the native graves were discovered, so-called graves, because I mean, a lot of that was really inflated, and a lot of it
Thoroughly
was
disproven.
just yeah, disproven, and just a lot of speculation, to be quite frank. They nonetheless burned down like 26 churches, like even churches that like weren't here, like or weren't involved with like reservations, like the way like the Catholic and Anglican churches were.
Yeah, like
They didn't even play a role. Like,
I think
but
one
again,
one
it's a
case I
cultural,
saw.
ethnic, and racial thing. That's what it
Yeah, it
like.
yeah. Go on.
Go ahead. No, no, I'm done.
Okay, but yeah, you're making an interesting point where it was pretty much anything was just fair game at that point, and really just the symbol of a church of Western and ethnic European identity, even beyond the religious component. Just the idea that this is just what people who are of a white European background believe. This is where they gather, and these are the things that they build. Once again, it's a torching of those symbols. A lot of the reasons they pulled down the statues, even if it was of these in the U.S., I know that they would pull down these monuments to what was it the one black regiment of Union soldiers they were defacing, but anything that resembles any sort of artistic or cultural value of Westerners of any stripe had to go. Whether that's a church, whether that's a statue, anything really, and it has to be replaced with quote unquote, BIPOC art. Is I think it's BIPOC is the new acronym they've been using, or has to be replaced with modern art. The point where, yeah, as much as I hate to invoke it because it's a very cheap one, it is something of a cultural revolution within the West. And look, it's American style. It's the complete that's that unchecked revolutionary power. Going back to what you were saying earlier, um, but yeah, that's really what it boils down to. The point where it's everything has to be cleansed, everything has to be made anew. It is, and it's trite to say, it is almost messianic in its outlook to the
Yeah,
point where they are the sole ones who can come in and save everything and set everything right. and make everything anew. Once again, very very much, I would say, like a gross secular parody of Christianity, which I suppose you could say is Antichrist, the most literal definition. But,
Yep.
uh, and once again, if you're of a similar persuasion as us, you start to see these things, and I'll just say outright, I'll show my hand. Personally, I believe not that this is Antichrist stuff, but it's certainly precursor stuff, dude. This is the kind of stuff that we can expect in the end times. And look, I'm not
Hmm.
going to say how close we are. It's not my place, but these are the things that I suppose we've always looked at in our history and that we will continue to look at and that will only intensify as we get closer to the end. And of course, just speaking with the progression of time, every day we are closer to the end. I'm not saying that in any sort of like doomsayer thing. I'm not trying to predict the day to the end of the world. I haven't given fully over to schizophrenia yet. Don't worry. But point being is, these are the things you have to look at. In the most literal sense, in both a temporal and eternal sense, it is going to get worse before it gets better. I don't know, it may never get better in that temporal sense. Who knows? Like I said, I can only speculate so much in that. But getting back to the core issue here about the BLM riots in France, I mean, that's really the best summary. And I keep finding myself, yeah, it's just an instant mental association of BLM. That's the only thing.
Yeah.
And I mean, look, we're actually just out of an election cycle. France had elections in 2022. I doubt this is going to see any sort of government overhaul. Macron certainly isn't going to be affected by this, and I think this is quite the day for the based Macron people. He's certainly the leader of the
Yeah.
European of the European federalism, which is uh, Algerian BLM riots. This is what they had in mind. You know what? At least we're not speaking Russian.
Yeah. He's got to be, I think, one of the most disastrous presidents. I've his whole tenure, both have been marked by like excessive street violence and protests, a, a very chaotic and destabilized France. And when I was there in the summer of 2019,
Yeah, we actually have an interesting episode with
there there's
your
there's a malaise there,
with your photo
like
ops.
yeah, yeah. There is a kind of, I don't know, just kind of like, they don't seem happy to me. Um, they have they have their issues. They have major issues.
And to visit the old adage, I don't know how much this holds true today, but I imagine it still carries a large degree of truth. When France sneezes, Europe catches a cold. To reference Metternich, I doubt that these kind of events will
Yeah.
stay contained to France, especially in other nations with large amount of migrant populations. You might think the UK, Germany. I think even Spain has been struggling recently when it comes to a lot of the migration issues. But point being, in Western Europe in general, certainly the Netherlands and Belgium, this is something that's going to spread. You're going to see events like this certainly across Western Europe, and maybe even in some parts of, I guess, what could probably be called Central and Eastern Europe. Now, maybe not to the same degree because once again, the form of American occupation there takes a much different thing because they're needed as that meat grinder against Russia, so they're allowed to be a bit more quote unquote based. But I think certainly across Western Europe, you're going to see events like this probably take place semi frequently. It's going to be
Hmm.
just the I mean, because really, Europe is in checkmate. I don't know how many times I can say it, and I don't take any pleasure in saying certainly, but whether it's from the economic standpoint, the cultural standpoint, the demographic standpoint, and I know I was just saying that at least in some parts of Europe, I think there's more demographic hope than there is in North America, but I'll say once again that gap is quickly closing, and without an immediate course correction, I'm talking like within before 2030, I would say, just to give a rough time frame at least. And again, there's
Yeah.
no solid base behind that, but that's just to give an example. Next 4 to 6 years, for example, then it's it's really complete checkmate for Europe. I mean, Europe certainly, I'll put it this way, Europe is certainly in check because once again the American Empire will put more and more pressure on Europe. They will go full scorched earth on Europe. It means denying it to Russia, denying it to China, or denying it any sort of strategic autonomy. And as much as, and well, here's the damnedest thing about all of this. As much as a lot of these Europeans might talk about the desire for strategic autonomy. You ever notice these are the Atlanticists who are completely in line with Washington's foreign and cultural policies? Exactly. There's no alternative there. The people who talk about Eurofederalism and European strategic autonomy are the first ones to kiss Washington's feet, the first ones to fawn when Biden gets elected, the first one to
Yeah.
demand American aid for their crusade against Russia, to the point where, yeah, these things may sound fine on paper, these things may make sense in the abstract, but at the end of the day, it's just laundering the American control of Europe by other means. And so many people fall for this. And otherwise intelligent people, people I'd respect, and look, I certainly won't take away other things to write about when it comes to that, but they fall for this meme of the European strategic autonomy, the European army based in Europe, whatever. Macron, the stupiditarian, Jupiterian president, and at at the end of the day, once again, this is just a much more laid back control of Washington, just the appearance of more autonomy. What do you think that European army is going to be used for? Do you think it's going to be used to defend the borders of Europe against migrants coming out of Turkey or wherever else? No, it's going to be on
Yeah.
the front lines in Ukraine, wasting European lives for American interests. And that's really all it comes down to. They've said it plain as day. I know Soros was referring particularly to Eastern Europeans, Poles, Ukrainians, Romanians, but what makes you think after they've exhausted those, they won't move west to Germans, to the French, to the Italians, to the Spanish, to the English? Of course they will. And there's really no
Yeah.
denying that. And anyone who is, I think, is either genuinely ignorant or choosing to live in ignorance of that. The fact that, once again, and I think after Nord Stream, it should be clear, the American empire is the worst enemy of Europe. I don't care what Russia is doing. I mean, look, I'm not saying you have to like the Russians. I'm not saying you have to think that they're on some great moral crusade. And look, I've made it clear. I personally find their war aims pretty reasonable. And I would say I have some degree of sympathy. Now, I can't be gung ho about Russia because fundamentally I'm just not ethnically and culturally enough, connected enough to Russia to really have that strong of an affinity. But I will admit, I admire the people. I like the nation. I like the culture. I've had good experience with Russians in my personal life. I'll say that much. Just laying my cards out on the table. But point being is, you can talk about the evil Mongol Mongols coming to invade Finland. Oh, they want Finland real bad for some reason. But
It's
at the
just
end of the
nonsense.
day, the real threat to Europe, the destructive force in Europe, is the American empire and its collaborators. And right now you're seeing that play out on the streets all across France. And I can
Hmm.
tell you, without a course correction, before the end of the decade, and that's even being generous, Europe will completely sink into irrelevance. And look, I know I've discussed this before. Once tension with China rise, once the Americans twist the arm of the Europeans to put sanctions on China, Europe doesn't have an economy. And like I said, I'm not saying
Hmm.
that in some great praise or defense of the Chinese. I would say ultimately my view on the Chinese is pretty neutral at this point. My positive opinions are pretty much balanced by negative opinions. I don't think that the Chinese are worth opposing, worth starting a world war over. But that doesn't necessarily mean I have a great admiration or warm feelings for the Chinese. I may the Russians, but point being is I'm not gonna kvetch about the Chinese doing X, Y, or Z in some African country. I think you all get the point here. But at the end of the day, Europe is going to be forced to cut off China at some point. And if it does, we're talking fourth world conditions. Now, look, I know third world, you might be thinking, what the hell is fourth world? I mean, the fourth world is a country that used to be first world that's completely collapsed, that doesn't have the, let's just say, more primitive traditions that keep the third world functional, in which case it becomes complete chaos. And Europe, unfortunately, is heading down that road, and barring some, let's just say, radical change. Of course, not that I would ever advocate anything illegal for any of the people at YouTube, but radical change, hypothetically speaking, let's just say for the sake of um, my own ass,
Hmm.
Europe is screwed. This is a continent that is going to become a continent-wide civilizational ruin. We're going to look at this how we look at the at like abandoned Roman settlements. It's getting to that point, and you might think I'm being hyperbolic. I'm not, and I think there was actually some interesting data that you sent me about emigration numbers out of Germany, where what was how many
Yeah.
like wasn't it like over the course of the past year about 1.5 million people emigrated either to Austria, Switzerland, the U.S. among other
Yeah.
locations, and I mean, look, I especially if Europe continues down the same path of cultural and economic destitution that it is on right now, You're going to see them emigrate other places. Honestly, as as ridiculous as it sounds, I could see, I don't know, maybe an Argentinian or Brazilian renaissance in terms of European migration, where because look, as twisted and as dysfunctional as those nations are, you're heading towards the heart of the empire. You're not going to win in America. You're not going to win in Canada. You're not going to win other places in Europe. So they're going to go to these, let's just say, more peripheral parts of the world, and of course, very talented and skilled Europeans. They're going to go abroad. They're going to go elsewhere, and they're going to make a fine lives for themselves. I mean, the main example I can think of is those dismissed RAF pilots because they didn't fit the diversity quotas. Ended up training Chinese pilots, and you're going to see more and more of these stories as time goes on, especially as Europe imports more American racial politics. Look, I know the Supreme Court allegedly had their entire thing against affirmative action, and I think that's a bit trumped up. And whatever meritocracy is being allowed to return to America is because they realize we're actually about to get into a serious military engagement with Russia and/or China, which is uh, I won't name him by name because I don't know if he wants to be, but I'll give credit to a friend of the show for that take, who I think, if he's listening, which I'm pretty sure he is, he knows who he is. But um, point being is, I'll reiterate, barring a radical course correction, Europe is going to become Europe is going to become a relic of history. It's going to be, and look, that's assuming that its livelihood, its architecture, its signs of civilization get preserved and aren't completely trampled. I mean, it's getting to the point where, and I know it's ironic with like the Algerian migrants we've been talking about in the situation in France, but it's getting to the point where the economic incentives for migrants to come to Europe have dissipated, especially somewhere like the UK, which is just completely flailing economically. People are starting to go home, especially
Hmm.
people from like Poland, Romania. They're starting to go back because economic growth in most parts of Eastern Europe is outpacing that of the UK. And you're probably going to see this trend in other nations. Germany, I imagine, is one of them. I mean, Germany, you're getting another migration out of Germany that you haven't seen since the mid 19th century, mid to late 19th century, and it's surreal to see, especially when we were built with this century of European peace post World War II, and it's anything but. I mean, Europe was defeated in World War II. Regardless of your view of the German regime during World War II, you have to admit that with their defeat died any hope of European strategic autonomy, regardless of what you think of them ideologically. I'm just saying purely geopolitically, there's no other way for Europe to function as an independent entity, especially now that they've been forced into such enmity with Russia. Because maybe in the early to mid 2000s there was that opportunity. Maybe you could have had that Paris, Berlin, Moscow axis, but that bridge has been completely burned, and there's no hope of rebuilding that. I mean, it's ridiculous to think otherwise.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I echo all of that. It's just something that has to play itself out. Like
And
the
while
latest iteration of the American Revolution has to die.
absolutely, and look, while I'm doling out the black pills, as much as I think somebody like Orban is a great leader, much as I think he's done great things for Hungary, and as much as I think he has insulated himself against color revolutions with his, let's just say, institutional coups in Hungary, that is, it's a delaying mechanism. Eventually, a nation that doesn't have the weight to throw around like Hungary does will succumb because, I
They'll
mean,
just wait.
yeah, it's they just have to wait for Orban and his clique to lose power, and ultimately Hungary, with its geography, is going to be very easy to cut off from Russia. Expect them to destroy the Druzhba pipeline soon. I know Hungary has been making overtures to Serbia, and possibly there's hope for some regionalism in that regard, but even that's a bit of a long shot. But like I said, I mean, if they're going to blow up Nord Stream, they're going to blow up Druzhba at some point. They're going to try to at least. And I hope
Yeah,
that the Russians and all the affiliated parties have put in the necessary security measures. But if I recall, if I have my pipelines right, Druzhba runs right through Ukraine. That's easy enough of a demolition.
yeah, yeah. Um, Speaking of pipelines, I think there was one that the Ukrainians sabotaged on their own territory, running through Kharkov. But the thing that worries me is, you have this disaster of the Titan submarine, right? You have these uber wealthy people doing this, right? And the thing with powerful, wealthy people, right, is um, they can feel immune to just about any disaster. Um, they can invest, and if they lose like a ton of money, for you and me, it would be a ton of money. It would be over forever. Uh, we would be on this. For them, they can handle that, and this gives them an even greater sense of immunity. The thing that scares me is I think that's what the American elite is right now.
Oh, absolutely. And for the time being, as they still have the iron grip that they do on the world, it's going to remain that way. And look, frankly, I don't advocate any sort of violence or radical political change, but I'm just saying, speaking purely objectively, for the sake of the people living both inside and outside of North America, the American empire needs to it needs to go the way of the dinosaur. It's something that the world cannot sustainably live under. And
Yep.
like I said, as somebody who may have family in this country going back several generations, may have been the founding stock of this country. I mean, I think you, especially if you're listening to this program, you fully realize that this nation has betrayed everything that you and your ancestors had worked for, and that, frankly, this is, insofar as the American project had anything going for it in the first place, which I think you could have that historical debate about. I'll lay that to the side for now. I mean, it's not yours anymore, and I'll remind you once again, if you're the descendant of Western European colonial settlers, especially of the American stock, of that Anglo, of that Scots Irish background. Ultimately, your ancestors saw fit 400 years ago to hop on a boat and move halfway across the world. And look, they would have moved. They would have set up shop somewhere else long before this. And I'm not telling you how to live your life, but I'm just saying, if you feel a desire to stand your ground, as honorable as that is, you have to remember that you're descended from a settler people who, once again, risked life and limb in order to escape to build themselves a new land where they could live on their own terms. And, there may be merit to that. I don't know where that is, but uh, and I'm not going to recommend anyone does anything with their lives, but I just want to present that perspective to you that you aren't necessarily running away, and you're doing what your ancestors did all those years ago, all those centuries ago.
Hmm.
And I don't think there's any shame in that. And especially if you can find something uh, prosperous and fruitful elsewhere, no matter where that might be, then by all means, don't feel any hesitation about that. That'd be my advice to you personally. But I mean, I guess that's all I had for tonight. If you have any last minute stories.
Just to continue with the black pilling, some unfortunate news um, regarding the Kiev Lavra and UNESCO. UNESCO has taken the relics. These are also include relics of saints, and now they will be part of uh, the auspices of UNESCO. So we
So
had
they'll never
last
be seen
week,
again.
yeah, exactly. So we had last week Kurti going to the Vatican claiming that all these Serbian Orthodox churches and murals are his when they're not. They belong to Serbians. So yeah, it's a kind of a cultural looting. It's a it's a humiliation ritual.
This is what awaits your nation under the reign of the American Empire. Even if you aren't aligned with it, like the Serbs, they'll still find a way to loot and plunder you. Now,
Hmm. Hmm.
it's look. I think it just goes to show the amount of cultural destruction waged by the regime in Washington, and it doesn't matter who you are, what cultural or ethnic or religious background you're from. They want you destroyed all the same. They want you part
Yeah,
of. I know the term has been abused to death, but I can't think of a better one. They want you part of the neoliberal machine. They want you to be another cog in it, and they're willing to go do anything in order to accomplish that. And it's the reality we have to live with. Potentially, it can be overcome one day, but for the time being, the reign of terror continues. And I hate to end a show on this note, but it's really all I can say.
yeah.
So thank you everyone for tuning in. Hopefully we'll have a much more optimistic show. I know I kid myself with that. next episode. But until then, we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.